Well, it is so good to see everyone here, and welcome back to, now it's not wanting me to, now I'm about to stall for a second. It's like it's not wanting to let me share it's going to ask my computer something if I will allow it to do this. So now I really have to really show off my computing skills to type and talk and get it to do its thing all at once. Um, well, you know what? I might need to quit and reopen. Um, Let me see if I can do it later on my own time. And Jocelyn, if you will watch or you guys at Westminster, actually, if you're still there, let's see if this works. You can see my screen. Can you see my screen? Are you able to see that?
Yes. Yes, we see your screen.
Okay. And I think that it's recording. So
Yes, it shows recording on the top left.
Okay, good. We're going to keep charging then. Good, good, good. The computer was acting like I needed to start over and that would have thrown everything off. I'm like, no, no, no. Okay. Well, good evening, good evening, good evening. Thanks for the technical challenges there. As I was saying earlier to people that we've got Zoom gave me a new copy. And anyway, so we're kind of figuring out some new pieces of the technology, and Valencia has just started up this past week. So we're in week 2, but we haven't had any Zoom meetings, thankfully enough. So I haven't really been able to practice with the new version of Zoom. So anyway, it's all good. Tonight is part 3 of our work on Antiquity, which, as I've said before, is as much as anything a response to requests from you guys. And that gives me a chance to reiterate what I've said many times, that my hope for Valencia at Westminster, the program that we've created, would be something that you find very appealing, but also addresses questions that you might have. So as we look into 2021, and I'm actually already scheduling out into the fall, I'm really kind of excited. Got a whole series of my peers who were able to come last year. You know, we were kind of just working our way through the pandemic, so we weren't really sure. Professor Bryson joined us, as you remember, in the fall. But anyway, we're going to have a whole host of professors. Professor Macon's going to come back, and we're going to do some more looking at math. Professor Borglum's going to come back later in the spring. We're going to do some literature. Professor Bryson's going to come back, who's been here before, I just mentioned. Professor Robinson, who you may remember did a session with us on the Roman Republic, is going to do a 3-part, I think 3 parts, on the Roman Empire. And I've got some other feelers out to a few other of my peers who are amazing. So I'm already scheduling way out into the summer. So I'm really excited. But that doesn't change the fact that I want this to be something that you find enjoyable. So that if you have topics, whether they're very broad topics like the Middle Ages, and one of my professor friends who you've not met before, Professor Lindsay McNellis, who is a real expert in the Middle Ages, is going to do a 2 or 3-part series for us on the Middle Ages. And kind of culture and society, which has been her emphasis, is going to come join us. That's another professor. But if you had a topic where you're like, I want something I'd like to know, I really want to do my best to try to answer that if I can. That can't always, because I can't find somebody, or the people I find I might not think are a strong enough presenter, in my opinion. Kind of be judgmental, I suppose. But I'm protective of you guys. But I want to work it in to kind of see, to present something they'd be interested, whether so it could be something very narrow, like a time and place, a president, that kind of a thing, or it could be very broad. Most of what we've done has been fairly broad, but anyway, let me know. Either let Ashley or Becca know, or you can text it in the chat feature right now. You can email me. I think most of you have my email. I'd be more than happy to give you my direct email. And so we'd love to be able to do that. And this topic here, these 3 weeks, and I think we're going to stretch for 2 more weeks, is I think the plan, to kind of stay in the time of antiquity. And we're going to kind of look at some of the civilizations and kingdoms that came after the Egyptians and Mesopotamians. That's my plan right now for next week. But this was a request somebody made, more than one person, when I asked. They said, well, how the human got started, the beginning of humanity. And then in particular, more than one person asked about religion. And so this was one of the questions that I thought, well, maybe there's a way I can do these together. I actually tried to get some of my, see if I can find another friend or two who might be more competent in particularly the Greco-Roman gods. But I wasn't able to do that. So you're just stuck with me. I'm actually a little nervous tonight because it's I never made claims of old antiquity being like my area of expertise. I jokingly tell people when they ask, because we teach survey level courses from ancient Mesopotamia to modern day ISIS, I can talk about it. And that's true. But nonetheless, you're certainly not an expert in everything. And there are areas like my friend, Professor Robinson in the Roman Empire, or my friend, Professor McNellis in the Middle Ages, or Professor Bryson with modern day rights types things. You just kind of give yourself over to the expert and let them take the lead. But I'm gonna do my best, again, because you guys asked. So tonight we're looking at the third series. So the first thing we did is we kind of just considered antiquity and tried to answer the hard question of, well, how can we know any of this is true? We certainly weren't there. And even if you say, well, we weren't there in the Civil War, I could say, I know my grandfather who's now passed, and his father was the son of a Civil War veteran. So there's a living connection that I could have even back to the 1850s, where I could have talked to my grandfather and he could tell me stories. You see what I'm saying? But when you get way on back, how can we know? And it is a true question for the 1700s, 1500s. But there you say, well, we have printer, we had the printing press. So you feel a little more competent. By the 1200s, we begin picking up we still have the original copies of things. I told you prior to the 1200s, really prior to the 1100s, we really have no originals of anything. So it's, we said, well, how can we know? So I kind of gave you a starter version of how historians figure things out. And then last week we looked at, and hopefully you watched the video. I know some people had some technical difficulties, but if you didn't, you should go back and watch it to say, well, can we glean things about human civilization that would be useful in understanding how the world works today? So often I hear people making statements, usually in frustration, like, I can't understand why this is that way, or why are those people like that? And many times what they're complaining about, I would suggest, is actually just normative to the human species. Certainly we have evolved in certain things. There are things that we don't do now, say in Crime and Punishment, that we did 200 years ago, right? But there's other things that are more kind of to our core as either a person or as society that I find no changes really over 6,000 years, which isn't to say good or bad things. It's just to say that if I wonder why someone who's frustrated acts out, lashes out, rebels, this kind of a thing, which we've seen around us for, a decade or more, or really more. Well, the answer to that is that's what humans have done when they feel unhappy. I did a podcast. If you're on Facebook, you could find this podcast. I posted it, where I was interviewed, and the person was asking about free speech and was saying, well, yeah, but isn't that censorship, what we were talking about? And I said, but that's what always happens. Every society censors speech that they don't like. There's not like a God view of like what's good and what's not good. I mean, there is a God view, and we're talking about religion, where there, you can say this is, God says these things, but there's not like a universal right that humans have accepted about, say, free speech. And so rebellions come when some group feels themselves unhappy. Today in my Western class, we were talking about what you and I talked about in December, how the Romans created their republic. And one of the students noted that the move for the plebeians to get more rights and more inclusion was a 200-year journey. And so how do you think they got those rights? They weren't just given to them by the rich and powerful because, oh, I feel sorry for you. They got those rights because they rebelled and kind of pushed their agenda and felt like they had been muzzled or excluded. So that's what everybody does. It's just kind of in there. So we saw those lessons. There were several. And one of the ones that we saw, though, was this one, right? So this slide, and I highlighted the kind of focus of what we're going to do tonight, because out of that list of, I think there are maybe 20 or 25 things that I at least find in antiquity that tells us about the human today that I think is useful and important. In fact, let me stop there and say, one of the things, particularly as we're tiptoeing into religion, that I think is important is that I worry when society today acts like that previous 5,500, 6,000 years of norm is of no value. And of course, there are some things we could look at and say, I do think that that was a negative in some capacity, ergo, we shouldn't do it now, or I don't want us to do it now. But a lot of times it seems as if the modern, and maybe this is also a human thing, but the current day humans always seem to think they know best. And I find actually that it's a stronger position to say, well, what do we know from history that might inform us that this should be something that we preserve? So one of the things we saw was this one in bold, and that the ancients believed that there were powerful other forces at work in the world. There's also, in the next bullet point, although this is not the kind of central issue tonight, is that they also believed that there was a good and a bad, right, which speaks to moral or value. And they always reference that connected to these powerful other forces. But anyway, the focus is, why are we talking about it? Well, because these ancients believed there are powerful other forces. But I think also we should ask it from a modern, like, why are you guys interested? And this is not what any one of you said to me. But I think when people ask the question, why religion? There is almost a negative tone to it. Like, well, why in the world, almost, why in the world would these people have believed these things? And where does that come from? Well, I think these are misconceptions, and I think they're wrong. There's a misconception that religion is dangerous or harmful, either to the individual or to society at large, which is often connected to this, that, well, religions have caused more deaths or more wars, which is just fundamentally false on its face. If you want to isolate down to wars by religion, there certainly are those. But you can't just say, hey, well, there was a war and the Mongols rolled across, the Middle East and they killed, many millions of Islamic people, ergo it was a religious war, or suggest that somehow, excuse me, that the Mongolian belief structure was what led them, and because they killed Muslims, bad. That's not a religious war by any stretch of the imagination. So there are religious wars, and we talked about some of those in the 15 and 1600s, but there's not actually more deaths or more wars caused by religion compared to, particularly, when you start adding up, and the 20th century kind of outweighs everybody else. But if you even took the 20th century out and looked at the things, there's more deaths from other wars and pandemics and issues than there was from religion. I think also then thirdly, people ask the question again, kind of, well, why? Why are we even talking? Why would you be interested? Why would those people be so dumb back in those days to think of religion, right? And that comes from a post-Enlightenment. We've not really studied the Enlightenment here. I actually have been thinking about it, spending part of our year, we'll see how it goes, in the 1900s, post-French Revolution in Europe, since we covered America last year at the same time. But one of the things from the Enlightenment, if you may remember just from your own time in school, the Enlightenment is positioned as this moment when reason overcame superstition, is the way they'll often be stated. And it absolutely is true that the writers of the Enlightenment era, so time of the 1700s, were largely saying, not all of them, by the way, but most of them, that religion is bad, Christianity in specific, the papacy, Catholicism, these are bad. There is a clear reaction from the Enlightenment writers connected to the wars of religion that we did talk about. And so, that even though the Romantics came in the later 1900s as a reaction to the Enlightenment, right? So Romanticism, particularly in literature, but also I think just generally, we talk about it as a force in the world in the 1900s when we do our Western civilization modern study, was to say, wait a minute, spirituality, religion is not the bad that you've pointed out to me. But however, I think in the grand scheme of things from, say, the 1700s, the Enlightenment won, W-O-N, versus the Romantics, right? So there's that sense. And so people perceive it must be dumb or stupid to believe in religion. And then I think, as I've said already, there's kind of this modern idea that we're just smarter than everybody else, which again, and I'm talking about myself right now, because I'm alive now, right? I'm one of these people, I'm one of us, right? There's an arrogance to that just is unwise. Because even though we can look back at certain times and think to ourselves, well, those people, whatever time we're talking about, they didn't have the same understanding that we did. And certainly in realms of science and technology, our current world is certainly advanced. It's ahead, right? Nobody had split the atom before the 1940s, clearly, right? Electricity before the 1900, 1890s, right? So yes, absolutely, that's true. But on the realm of like knowledge and life and living, I just don't think that there's a fair enough, I don't think it's fair to imply that somehow we're just smarter than peoples who've lived before. So I mean, there's that negativity that comes there. But then, so why then does it matter, right? And again, from antiquity, we get this idea that the human in herself has this born, at birth concept or an awareness of a desire for grasping the deeper purpose of transcendence. In other words, it doesn't take long for a child to begin asking why, because they can perceive something like the wind, right? Or rain. Like, what is rain, mommy? And of course, there is a scientific answer. That's true. But as my third bullet point is showing you, a lot of what the science, at least my reading of science, shows us is that you still can work your way through all the knowledge that we do know, and you reach a floor upon which it's not solved as to, well, how do we get to there? Meaning there's a, as one theologian wrote, there's a prime mover, right? That we can't compute. There's no solution for that. The idea of a irreducible complexity when you consider the eyeball, right, or the reproductive system in both a man and a woman, and you realize there's no way that science explains that really solves the issue, and it leaves me curious, right? In both ancients and now, people ask these questions. In fact, I've said for years, and this is slightly off topic, when people say, what's wrong with our country, or what should we do with our country, or what would you do with the country? And I've been asked this question for now almost 20 years. I always start with the same thing. Well, our problems are a spiritual problem. And what I mean by that is not, hey, everybody should become a Christian. Although as a Christian, all my cards on the table, you guys know I'm an ordained minister. As a Christian, I certainly would love for people to become Christians. And if you ever want to talk about that privately, let me know. But that's not what I mean when I say things are spiritual. What I'm saying is these questions here, that the ancients were unafraid to ask these questions. And somehow, again, maybe post-enlightenment, maybe some kind of stigma, we're afraid to have this conversation because we're afraid to be curious. Well, they weren't, and they kind of dug into it. So, what does that tell us, or where does that leave us? The religions that we can find in antiquity, and we're going to do tonight, is we're just going to cover antiquity. We're not going to get to Christianity. We may do Christianity some other day. We're not getting to Islam. We may do them. So we're just kind of staying in the ancient world, just so you know. When you look at the ancient world, there's a lot of commonality, which for myself, I find appealing. I find comforting. I find it actually, to me, answers a lot of questions or matches assumptions that I have. That's just me personally, which is not kind of what we're talking about. But what are these religious common aspects that they have? I've already said this part, but to say it again, it starts with that curiosity of the natural world. They not only were curious, but there was a revered status to it. There was a sense in which they saw the movement of things and they believed there had to be a reason for it, right? So now, again, here's an example. You and I could say, well, I can tell you what the sun is, and I could tell you that it actually technically doesn't come up, but we spin around. And I could tell you about the moon, and that's fair, and you'd be correct. Scientifically, we could explain these things. And yet at the same time, if we allow ourselves to go deeper and we have some reverence to it, we can sort of begin to, I think, say, maybe there's something I should still hold in awe of, the idea that there is a sun and the earth is perfectly positioned in a way that life could be here, but is not on Venus or on Mars. And that's not just a luck of the draw kind of thing. So then how I explain that beyond that statement can go in various streams, but it still starts with this kind of reverence for that world. Another common aspect is that they believed then that there was multiple forces or gods at work in the events of the natural world. Both, again, the natural idea, like what causes the tides, what causes the waters, this kind of a thing, and man-made events, right? So what caused war, what caused love, what caused murder? Why did this man love this woman and not that other woman? And why does that third woman love him, but he doesn't love her back? What explains that? And again, in our modern age, we can kind of get kind of arrogant, like, oh, I can tell you that. And I think the more correct answer is, I have no idea why that happens. And the idea that there is a God, maybe a God with wings and a bow, is actually not far-fetched to contemplate. I hope I haven't lost a bunch of you right there. You're turning off your computer going, oh, if he believes in Eros, I'm not going to listen to this guy. I'm not trying to suggest that these are my beliefs. In fact, we're not really covering my beliefs. But as a historian, when I look at society and culture, and I try to honor the cultures, I just try to bring that into my own thought process of understanding. Note that the gods, there's kind of overlap. We'll show you a couple of slides that really show you that. We'll see that in the Mesopotamian Valley. And then later, if I do show you, I think next week, the kind of growth of empires from Assyria to Babylon to Persia, there's certainly some carryover, right? But if you go down to the local level, so I'll use here locally, right? So Orlando's gods versus Winter Park's gods versus Maitland's gods. We certainly, being this close to each other, even say pre-car, so just with horses or foot travel or a chariot or a wagon, we would know of each other, and we would probably know that there's a certain god or a certain temple in a certain place. But nonetheless, we would say, hey, here in Winter Park, this is our thing. So there may be some reverence for our God over in Daytona, but they probably aren't worshiping our God as like the lead god. And this is why you see, for instance, like in Athens, Athena is the god they worship. Or if you read Homer and the Trojan War story, you know that the Trojans worshipped one of the gods and highlighted versus another one of the gods. And, so there's that kind of a story. And even when you get to these larger empires, and so you'd have, oh, the God of the United States is X, that wouldn't really usually stop at a local level, this sense of reverence for, our God, for the God that we have in our spot. And so I think that's useful for us to try to understand. There's some common stories and common ideas in the religions that go along with then this sense of kind of common understanding. There's just a real commonality when you cross over. I mean, yes, there certainly is difference when you look at Hinduism and you look at, certainly if you go into Asia where it's not so much connected to specific beings and more connected to like idea. But nonetheless, I think there's some usefulness to us. One is that there is always some sort of a creation. In some capacity, the human is brought forth, usually a couple, not always a couple, brought into existence. The flood story, so showing that the god or gods can impact to a sense of punishing, is in the mix, and it's throughout, right? So I find that very comforting. Many of the faiths tell a story of a moment when all people were in interaction together, usually with the common language, and then there's a problem, they get in trouble, the gods don't like it, and they get split apart. Sometimes the story is just depicting the human in their brilliance, and then they get punished. Sometimes the story is simply told as a way of why are there different languages. So there's not really a punishment per se in the story. Not as many of these as the flood myth. There is usually a story of conflict amongst the gods. The gods never work in harmony together. There's never, or there's rarely, I try to say never and always. I try not to say. There rarely is a story where the gods are all on the same page. Again, the Trojan War is a great example of that. And many times, and this isn't on the list, but many times because there's a struggle, the humans get connected, get influenced, get drug in. And then many times the gods, there's a kind of a human sense, we would say, of how they act, right? So there's betrayal, there's changing sides, there's, this god's friends with this god's, but now they're on different sides because of this conflict, and that kind of thing. Sorry, when you read the follow-up, so volume 2, right, to the Iliad, when you read the story, the Odyssey, right, it's hard to read that one and not just feel for the humans, because there seems to really be, at least at some level, a capriciousness of the gods, which is sad. But that's not unique just to the Greeks. And I'm pretty sure almost all of them, there is some sense of a next, an afterlife. Now, certainly, as we'll show in a second, like in Hinduism or in gods that believe in reincarnation, the next or the afterlife is just a repeat of this. But even there, you're ultimately, theoretically, working towards working to a conclusion. It may take you several attempts to reach kind of the final ultimate, but there's still that aim. You're still going to that. And the actions that you take, usually in context with the god or gods, depicts what happens, right? So sometimes, again, like with the Greeks in particular, which are perhaps the most famous of all the story, there are stories of the different gods, but not like the Greeks, because again, we're in the West, in the Western civilization, the Greeks were kind of always in the mix of that. But nonetheless, sometimes a person, we would say, kind of gets screwed, they kind of get taken to a bad place. Hades is not a bad place. It's not like there's a bunch of humans in Olympia and then the bad people in Hades. That's their story's a little different there. So it's not always that there's a nasty afterlife, like in some, where there is a positive paradise and then a horrific, pit of some kind. They don't all have that, but they do all have an answer to that question of what happens to us after we die. Is what happens to the soul. There you go. The flood narrative, again, I find it just fascinating. I'm sorry I'm drinking so much water, just so you know. My throat's been really sore this week. I'm not sure. I'm not sick that I know. Sorry. No, usually I have to explain that. I'm drinking a lot. 25 different religious groups and cultures tell a flood story. I know that in our modern minds, we go, well, that's ridiculous. That couldn't happen. And I just will try to take a more innocent, childlike view of saying, well, just because I haven't seen it in my world, in my time, does not mean that it could not have happened. It's kind of to me, a gross assumption being made. And in particular, in this story, when there's so many different religious groups depicting it, it seems to me like that's a lot of evidence to say, yeah, something happened. Of a vast extent. So it couldn't just be some local flooding, and they all had local flooding and wrote the story, because the stories, as you can see, are all generally catastrophic. There is some moment when God or the gods have decided, yeah, we're done with this. You all have screwed this up, and we're going to start over. So, it's not just in the Jewish scripture of the Jewish Bible, which is the most famous, right? Noah and his whole story, but that there's a multiplicity of these stories at some level that have a lot of commonality. And I could give you more there, like why I think that is and what I think it means. I don't think that's really our purpose tonight, but I just think that it's a useful thing for us to be aware and say, like I might have been somebody who thought either Christianity or Judaism is dumb. And certainly one reason I might say that is because of the flood story. And now I'm seeing, oh, wow, the Aztecs told the same story. Wow. Oh, okay. I might need to, check my attitude and be more reflective, I guess is the point. There's obviously differences. So, there's some, but the commonality outweigh the differences. And so when we talk about the early religions, again, this is kind of what we're looking at. I will confess tonight, we're just going to stay in Western civilization, although I will mention and show you stuff about Hinduism. I'm not even a neophyte to be able to really give it a fair grasp. And please understand that when you look at these dates, like the Greek gods, the Roman gods in particular, and Buddhism is a little different because it's obviously connected to Buddha, who did live at a time. But with the Greek gods, the Roman gods, Judaism, Hinduism to some degree, it goes back, right? I mean, just because we don't have the written source that gives a specific date, like the Greeks in particular, and the Romans who were, in Rome prior to 600, they had a concept, right, of their gods. It just may be that we don't have it written down. And with the Greeks, as I'll show you, Homer really becomes a starting spot for us. So anyway, those dates, but there you can see them, right? Kind of see how they've developed. And most of these are either with us today, Hinduism, Judaism, Confucian, or they're known, right, very clearly. The Mesopotamian gods are probably the least known of this group. So let's go. So Egypt, right? So Egypt has an extraordinarily complex pantheon. Most of these religions that have a pantheon of gods, either, I mean, it's a few hundred, which is a lot. Like if I told you to start writing down all the natural things in the world, so the wind, right, thunder, hail, snow, sunrise, the breeze, different animals, you're still not going to come up with 2,000 things. So 2,000 things is a gigantic pantheon. And in particular, when you know comparatively Egypt to Mesopotamia, Egypt is the example of the centralized large empire. In the Mesopotamian Valley, there's no large empire for several hundred years. So when we talk about antiquity, 3000 BC, you're talking about small city states. So you'd expect them to have a lot of variety, and they do, as I'll show you in a second. But the Egyptians do also. They do have a lot of local gods, and over the centuries, so there's three great moments in the Egyptian society prior to their fall, really with the time of the Greeks, in these kingdoms of several hundred years of deep unity. And so various gods kind of rise and go up. The Egyptians, and to some degree the Mesopotamians, but the Egyptians, their view of the gods was not adversarial. And to some degree, you can see that in their view of death, right? In their view of death, there's a movement to a better world, better life, better situation. To some degree, that's connected to their experience with the Nile. And as I'll show you in a second, when you look at Mesopotamia, their view of death is really negative. The gods are adversarial, and there's a lot of harm done, and life is very capricious. Well, that reflects their experience with the Tigris and the Euphrates. So Egypt's Nile has always had a very regular flooding, and they were able to really figure that out. Tigris and the Euphrates was much more volatile. So Osiris is kind of one of the lead gods there, and there's a story connected to him of his death, his resurrection, kind of as being saved by his wife and then reborn. That kind of is why they view death this way. That's why you have the mummification process, that you are being preserved for a better passage. There's a better experience. That's why, this part's kind of, we would not like this part, but, for the great pharaohs, their alive slaves and servants would be in food items, would be put with them, right? So that would be horrifying if you're one of those people. But why? Because you need your servant when you wake up in the other world, kind of a story. Interestingly, the gods in Egypt are typically in a not human form. They might sometimes have like a legs, but there's a body, the head of a jackal, right? There's different types of pictures depicting them. Mesopotamian gods, just the opposite, almost always anthropomorphic, kind of with human form and characteristics. The big gods for Egypt: Osiris, Isis, Horus, Seth, Ra, and Anubis. I mean, I'm not going to try to explain beyond like what's written here for you. Osiris and Isis and their story connected with Seth. Horus is their son, but so there's this kind of interchange or interaction of like how the Egyptians kind of explain purpose for the world in this kind of back and forth between Osiris and Seth. Seth, the god of chaos, god of violence, he murders Osiris, chops him into pieces. Isis is able to, kind of bring the family back together, and so protecting things. And in Egypt, again, very common to the ancient world, a focus on mother, father, child, family at the core of the story. Anubis is very important as the god of funerals. Again, that passage of life being a very positive thing. Well, if the Egyptians are positive, the Mesopotamians not so much. And again, thinking with the Mesopotamians, no sense at all of a unified structure. So for them, life very bleak, death very bleak. This also, I think, reflects the difference between the small city-states that were being constantly in war compared to the Egyptian empire, which was largely stable. There were wars, but not internally like you would have experienced in the Mesopotamian Valley. Here in Mesopotamia, because of that, it's not clear, or I would say it's not clear, as to which gods are most important, or there seems to be some importance. So here you can see those three gods there, An, Anila, and Inika, but they have different names. And again, the experts, not me, the experts are like, oh, they mean the same thing. Okay, I believe you, but why? Well, that's because different places had different groupings, right? So in Samaria, they had the 7 gods who make decree. And you can see there's our big 3, but there's 4 other people. But then there's other places in the Mesopotamian Valley that say, no, there's 4. And so we get the big 3 plus the Nehersag jumps in, right? And so it's kind of like, really, I'm not really totally sure. And then you've got Utu, right, who is in the 7 gods, but he's not in the 4. Not a good or bad. It's just that there you're talking about different city-states. And in those different areas, different gods would be highlighted or lifted up or acknowledged kind of in their importance. Some of the Mesopotamian gods, if you do read the Bible, you may know of because of the conflict that causes for some of them for the Jewish people in the interaction with those gods. So I bring that up only to point out that throughout the Mesopotamian Valley, and now I'm including the Fertile Crescent, right? So you go up the valley to modern day Turkey and then come back down on the map. I'll show you a map in a second. Down along the Mediterranean, east coast of the Mediterranean. And you're going to have these gods and peoples with their own gods in an interaction there with one another. Okay. In India, this is the one I'm the least competent to talk about, so confessing already and upfront. Interestingly, that's unique there is that there's a pantheistic aspect that gets folded in. So pantheism, sort of God is in everything and everywhere, whether that's God singular or gods, but they're not named, right? It is just that God's in the wind, and God's in the soil, and God's in the bumblebee, right? So there's those kinds of things. And there's not a God of death, there's just kind of God in that moment of the passage of the body. So there's kind of a blendedness of that. It's all centered around this Brahman, right? So it's not really a person. I know people who have tried to say, oh, that means that's the equivalent of, say, Allah and the equivalent of God. That's not my reading of the what the Hindu teachers say. I've not really read the Vedas. I've read the Upanishads a little bit. And there is, like I mentioned earlier, when you look at in Asia, there is the idea that religion is to some degree ancestral, but it's really more thought-based. So we think of Confucianism, Buddhism. There's temples involved, but it's really more of thought and action and kind of proverbs that you live by kind of thing, and that kind of just guides you generally and how to act. I think Hinduism is that bridge. And there's a relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism, which we're not going to dig into, but there's a relationship there. So I bring all that back to Brahman just to say that while it is a creative force, it's really just almost the idea of the universe itself. But a key difference here, unlike what we've seen before, is whereas previously in all the other religions generally, there's life, this is it, then you die, and then there's the afterlife. For the Hindu faith, the afterlife is really a restatement of this life. So unlike, I guess you could link it to what the Egyptians were saying, but there's nobody getting put in a pyramid in India to prepare for now. There's no living servants being basically killed inside a tomb serving their God. There's just the idea that you're going to be reincarnated. And so everybody or most everybody or a lot of people that you see and know are actually on their multiple life. And so there's a connection there, which connects to the idea of karma, that there's going to be this, there's some force that's keeping score, which again, that does come up a lot in different religions. All of these groups have no real written book, right? So I assume, you know the Quran, you know the New Testament, the Christian writings, you know the Old Testament, the Christians' view of it, but the Jewish scriptures. So there's a very specific book. And in those three, there's a very specific founder, like this person. Buddhism obviously has a specific founder in the Buddha, but the rest of these, there's no real founder and there's no real writings. The Vedas and the Upanishads are the more generalized view of writings. The Vedas probably a little more important than the Upanishads. And you can see it's really more proverbs and ideas, revelations. There's no like historical writing to it. It's just, here's this poem from which some growth or some truth can be gleaned. Of the gods that get named, then there's Brahma, which is not Brahman, right? So there's Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. I think it's Shiva. Sometimes I've heard people say Shiva, but Brahma being the creator god, but not creating in the sense kind of like he's connected with Shiva, because Shiva's the destroyer, because again, reincarnation, there's a sense in which the universe being reincarnated itself. Yeah, there's some things I could ask questions of, and I have had some wonderful conversations with some people who are Hindu, actually, religious leaders in it. But nonetheless, that's kind of the connection there. Let's slide on to the Greeks and the Romans, because I do want to do Judaism, and we need a little more time with that and make sure I get it all in. No real text or founder, although Homer and Hesiod's writings are the ones that people turn to. But again, particularly with Homer, it's not like Homer made us up whole cloth. Homer is reflecting what he already knew in the culture, right? So oral tradition into something written. So these gods were already kind of in the mix. In the Greek story, what's interesting is there's a movement of the gods or a movement of the story, right? So sort of with the Greeks, the Greek gods, you need to say, well, wait a minute, which group are you talking about? Now there is a linkage in how that, so Hesiod gets into this. And you may know the idea, the story. There it is, obviously, that there's kind of in the beginning, there's chaos and Gaia, the Mother Earth. And then they have children, or Gaia produces the Titans, of which I think there are 10. Two of them, Kronos and Rhea, have children, and they're the Olympians. And then there's a prophecy that the Olympians are going to kill the Titans. So Kronos eats them all, but Rhea saves Zeus. So the point of all that is that there's a linkage between the three groupings, but I think it probably more accurately reflects the different times when we're looking at Greek history. So remember, we talked about this when we looked at Greek Athenian democracy, at least we mentioned it briefly, that there's a passage. So there's the Mycenaean era, there's the Dark Ages, then there's the kind of classical Greek time, then there's the post-Athenian time before the Romans come, right? So there's these movements that I think these gods kind of connect with them. The Greek gods are probably the most famous of all the gods, and I'm not going to read this list to you. You know these gods. I could have, if we were together, I'd probably ask you to tell me who are some of the Greek gods, and you'd start busting them out. There's more than this list, obviously, but these are the main ones who are either living at Olympia or Olympus, or who are connected. So Hades does not live there, but he's the brother of Zeus, so he's in charge of the underworld. And you can see by looking at these, again, this idea of the ancients that natural things, so like thunder, the weather, and then human creations like war, metalworking, these things are kind of, there's a God in charge of all of that. And again, there's more than this list. This is just the big list of the main gods. Now, they connect, again, the Athenians were brilliant. And again, I again find this comforting, not confrontive. For me, it's like, yep, I will continue to be humble about what we think we know. So when you look at in Lower Greece, so the core of Greece, when you say Greece and you mean the city states, you're meaning this area here. And you have this linkage between Delphi, Olympia, and Athens, which makes the sacred triangle. It literally is a triangle that mathematically works out in a way with one of the geometric rules. I need Brian here to kind of give the explanation, or one of you might could do it for me. And so you see this, you're just kind of like, wow. I mean, it's not like today where there's GPS and somebody said, hey, let's find 3 spots in America that are equidistant or have this kind of shape to them, and then we'll put holy places there, right? So, again, this is kind of a neat, and it goes even further when you include Upper Greece, right? So you go up towards Macedonia, and you bring in Dodoni and Dion, which also connect to Delphi. Delphi was the core. It was like the main spot, and I'm sure you've heard about the Oracle at Delphi. You ever get to go to Greece, it's a wonderful place to visit. Delphi, to me, was more fun than going to Olympus, to Olympia. I did take students to both, but Delphi was really cool. And so, there's the goddesses there, the keeper of the temple is there. They give speeches from the gods. And if you know your Trojan War, the Greco-Persian wars, that any reading of Greek history, Delphi is involved in the mix. This all gets shifted over to Rome, again, from some points of view as legacy from the Trojan War. So there's some carryover. The Romans do have a deeper ancestral type worship, much like the Chinese do, compared to the Greeks, right? The Greeks are aware of who came before, but they're not really praying to their family gods or to ancestral kind of previously here humans. The Romans do. The Romans have a similar kind of movement. There's kind of, as you can see, an initial kind of threesome of gods, which was really connected to some degree to the Etruscans and to the Samnites who are near them. But then later, there's kind of this blending to Greece. If you remember, again, we talked about a little bit when Athens and Sparta and Corinth and Thebes are really developing and growing, they're colonizing. So much of the Mediterranean world, certainly on the European side and into the Black Sea, is all Greek. It all begins as Greeks. They're there first, I guess you would say. And so the lower part of the peninsula for Italy, the boot, right? The lower part, the boot part, all that was Greek. And in fact, as Rome was going in their growth as an early republic before the Punic Wars, there's a big showdown that goes decades long between the Romans and the Greeks. It was sort of nip and tuck. And had the Greeks been more united back at home, or had not been really struggling through the aftermath of the Peloponnesian War, might have had a different story. In any case, they kind of move on over, and what happens is a lot of Greek thought and Greek perception, and in this case, Greek gods, they get moved over also, right? So ultimately, you end up with this, linkage between the gods, right? So in Greece, it's Zeus. In Rome, that becomes Jupiter. I think initially, so if you go back to this slide, and Mars, Carinus, and Jupiter, and then later, it says his wife June. It's really Juno. I don't know. I guess autocorrect. Minerva. These were gods that predated the Greeks, at least as best I can tell. And so I think later there's a blending that kind of happens where Juno and Hera become like similar or the same person. And so, it's an interesting kind of juxtaposition of watching these two close societies, which we know governmentally, we're doing this really odd thing of allowing government of the people, to see how their gods kind of blended together in the process. Well, in the time I have left, speaking of doing an odd thing, so everything to this point we've talked about has been what seems most obvious, that there are multiple gods dealing with the multiple influences and impacts. And then much like in Athens and Rome, there's this weird kind of, wait, what is that? Why would that? It's one thing to say, oh, there were 40% of ancient societies had government of the people, and then you don't think Athens and Rome is weird, right? They're not unique. But when it's the only one, well, there's no other religion in antiquity putting forth the idea that there's only one God. Now all of them have a lead God. I've shown you that, right? But none of them go where this group goes. So in 1025, there's a new kingdom established, and it's called Israel. And the people there are called Israelites or Hebrews, and they have a king. His name is Saul, right? So they kind of just show up in the historical record. There's this new kingdom. The Egyptians have to deal with it. The northern societies, the Assyrians, they have to deal with it. Hey, there's this group, right? There's other groups in history that kind of just show up also. So that's not necessarily the weirdest thing. But certainly then it causes us to say, well, who are these people? And then when you find out, well, they have this really unique idea that they believe in other forces. So everything's the same for them. They have the same kind of depiction of there's things that work in the world. But for them, it's a single entity, not a single chief with little minor entities, no, one single God. And so the story goes back another, 1100 years, really. And that there was a man named Abram who lived in the Mesopotamian Valley. And the story that he shares is that he was called out by this single God to say, I want to create a people group who know me, and then through me, will tell everybody else. Okay. Now, again, a God talking to a human, that's not unique. But the God making the claim that he's the only God, that doesn't happen anywhere else. Zeus never says that. Jupiter never says that. Brahman never says that. So he's the only one who's saying this. Okay. And he says, we're going to go on a journey. We'll take you to a place. So he takes Abram to this place. And this is the beginning of this interaction between a single God and a single people. Now, again, that a people group has a God, we've already seen that. But again, it's always a pluralistic God. Along the way, to kind of acknowledge that, hey, I put my stamp on you, several things happen. So the God asked for a physical thing, which we call circumcision for the males. And he changes the names. Abram's wife was Sarai, and he changed it to Sarah. And Abram becomes Abraham. And it is a familial story, so tribal. That part's not unique. And so Abraham has a child that God promises, Isaac. Isaac has two sons. Well, Abraham has more than one son too, but Jacob and Esau. And then from Jacob, who gets the birthright, he has 12 sons. And one of those is a boy named Joseph. So here's a map. So you kind of can see, this is later in the story when the kingdom, but the red and the yellow, think of it as like one place, all kind of one place. And obviously, like all other these kingdoms, it shifts and morphs over time, right? So there's times when it's smaller, times when it's bigger, that kind of a thing. But just so you could visually see, and where Abram was brought to was here on the, I don't know if you see my cursor or not, but right here on the Jordan River, between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea down here. So they weren't really taken necessarily to the coastline, but they were taken to this spot here. And so that's where he was. His family grows, and then he passes, moves on. So at this point, it's unique, but it doesn't necessarily mean anything. But again, we got to think about Saul, right? So kingdom, there's a kingdom. Where do these people come from? The one child of the third descendant, Jacob, gets sold into slavery and taken to Egypt. And in Egypt, he has interactions that ultimately, in a surprising twist, leads to him becoming like the prime minister. Now, there's been lots of searching for Joseph and the name of Joseph and the Egyptian name of Joseph, which I should have written down as the Jewish writings depict, that have been unfulfilling, right? There's a couple of options, but there's not as clear a piece as we would want. So this goes all the way back to our first day where we say, well, how do we know any of this stuff is true? Which I want to address now because I want to get through it. But just keep that first section in mind as we're talking about the ancient writing. So we have this text that is very well historically documented. So we're comfortable with the text, but it'd be nice if we had corroborating evidence in Egypt. We don't. We have some other pieces, but we don't have that piece with his name. Okay? He dies, obviously. And then the people in his descendants, so still family. Ultimately in the story, the 11 other brothers and even dad, they come, they live there. So now the people of Abram are not in that spot that I showed you between the Galilean Sea and the Dead Sea on the Jordan, on that river that they've left. Okay, so other people live there. That's going to be problematic as we go. Get back to the story. Shift forward about 400 to 500 years, and you end up with a guy named Moses. And Moses is one of these people, so they're all related, right? But now they've grown. There's several 100,000 of them, and they all are slaves. And the slave aspect and the city that has all been attested to. Moses has a next interaction with this God. So there's not really been any interactions with the God. Moses has an interaction. He says, "Go get my people out. I'll help you. You'll see." And he does. And they get out and they eventually make their way back to a kind of a mass migration. It takes a very long time due to a whole bunch of interactions with their God, quite honestly, their depiction of it, before they arrive back in that same land. So this takes us to the kingdom of Saul. They're now descendants up into the millions. It's not really clear how big necessarily. That's not a point to get too frustrated with. They still have a very clear picture of the 12, right? So there's a sense of each one being able to, I am a part of this part of the larger family of Abraham. And between Abraham and Moses, you get this kind of articulation of the God and the religion. In particular, while Moses is on the journey, God gives him a set of rules and guidelines, which now have to be for the whole people. And then they get back to the kingdom. There's a military invasion. They go back to that map that I just had for you. They basically invade down. Here's the city Jericho. So they basically come up this way on the eastern side of the Dead Sea, and then cross the Jordan River and attack at Jericho. So there is a military aspect to this, which is not our concern today. And throughout, there's this interaction between God and his people. Now, again, the interaction between God or gods and the people, that part's not unique. We don't go, wow, that seems kind of weird. We're kind of talking our way through seeing the differences. But again, the uniqueness is them saying that there's only one God, and this God is the only God, and he's chosen us for some reason. And the interaction between God and the people, very interesting. Usually there's a lot of times when they get in trouble and they don't do the right thing, there's punishment, this kind of a thing as you kind of go along. And there's more to it, obviously. There's more of a religious side of the story. But as far as understanding, that takes us all the way back to this moment when there's the kingdom. And again, this map would be better if it just showed one kingdom. This is like 3 generations past Saul, King Saul. But I just like the map because it's close up and you can kind of see. That takes us back to this then. The human ancient societies believed that there were powerful forces at work. And our look at it is to say that, or at least for myself, is to say, I accept that. In fact, we talked about this last time, and I'm just going to bring this slide to a close here. We talked about last time the idea of church separated from state, to use modern terms. So church meaning really just the Christian expression, and state, the government, but really meaning that to suggest this idea of religion is odd, that it should be separated. I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm not saying that I want there to be a national religion for the United States, or for the inauguration yesterday, there should have been a national priest who did something. I'm not saying that, but I am just saying that you kind of note when you look at antiquity, you kind of say there is this interaction that the people have with the world that is unseen. And I think there's benefit to that. I think that it's worth continuing one's own private investigation, kind of deeper into it. Again, we didn't get into the more modern from a certain point of view, religions of Christianity and Islam. And we didn't even look at what happens with Rome. Rome, at the same time of Christianity, will sort of shift religions and bring emperor worship into their stories. That's a whole different conversation. Hopefully I did okay. Again, it's a tough job making through all those and giving them their proper due and helping you kind of see. Again, I wish we were in person so we could talk about it and you could ask me some questions. Don't hesitate to email me questions. Don't hesitate to give them to Becca and say, hey, ask him this, and I'll answer it first thing on the next session. We will be here again next week, and I look forward to, I'm pretty sure I'm going to go and give you a little bit more about the Israelis, but around the people that are with them, because it kind of links us ultimately into Greece. We'll see. I may choose something else. I thank you so much for being with us, and I will look forward to seeing you next week. All right. Thank you so much. Bye.